I have actually just recently written an article called Play a New Renaissance, and it is really exciting area to be working in at the moment, I think, and hopefully I can share some of that excitement with you over the next 40 minutes or so, because for various reasons, I think you alluded to the difficulties of defining what we mean by play. People have been writing about play, talking about children's play and so on for more than 100 years now, and still we don't have an agreed definition. Everybody has their own view and so on. It's a very nebulous, very complex thing to try and define, and it's also a very difficult area to start to research. In most psychological research, you get some people in who are your subjects, you tell them what you want to do, they get on with it, and you score whatever they're doing and so on and so forth. But of course, getting a few 4-year-olds into a room, as you well know, and saying, right, I'd like you to play, and I'd like you to play at this, with this, in this way, please. Now, okay, and I'm going to film you and analyse what you're doing. And, obviously, play by its very, nature is spontaneous, it happens when you're least expecting it, and so on. So it's very difficult to run what you might call controlled experiments on play. However, the good news is that at the moment, and we can speculate about why, having been somewhat in the doldrums, I think, for a while, there is really a big renaissance in the research area of interest in play, and I'm going to hopefully share with you some of the new ideas and the new work that's being done. But also what's very exciting is that at the policy level, not only in Jersey, but in many, many countries all over the world, particularly in early childhood education, policymakers are really starting to get the message that early childhood education should be playful if they want it to be effective. But this is starting to be recognised as if you want children to be able to be effective, powerful learners, that needs to be embedded in early playful experiences. Okay, so just to say that if you really want to read a lot more about this, I've written 2 reports over the last few years, both of which are available as free downloads on the internet. So a report called The Importance of Play and another report called Quality in Early Childhood Education. If you put those words into Google and my name, these will pop up pretty much at the top of the list. And they're about 30 pages long, and they basically summarise a lot of the things I'm going to talk about to you in the next, 30 minutes, but obviously in a much more considered and thorough and well-structured way I can probably manage now. So I'm going to try and cover 3 basic areas, just to share with you some of the emerging evidence we have about why it turns out that play actually, we've always believed that play is important. If you respond and work with young children, just from your experience, how significant it is in children's lives. We're beginning to understand why and what kinds of ways in which it might be. And in particular, we're beginning to understand how play influences children's learning. And I think that's quite an important development, because it means we can start to look for certain types of play, or certain characteristics in children's playfulness, and we can start to support the sorts of characteristics that are going to, we know, make a really significant difference. And then I'm going to finish off with just a list of what I think are some of the basic implications. So let's look at the evidence. Now, one of the exciting things about play research these days is it's being done, although I'm a developmental psychologist and a lot of psychology being done, there's been all sorts of work being done in a whole range of different disciplines. So in evolutionary psychology, where you study the psychological development in earlier evolving species, we were at Jersey Zoo the other day, and there was a map showing how humans were related to reptiles and apes and so on and so forth, and how we all emerged and so on. And of course, as you go up the evolutionary development, what you discover is, and this is something that Jerome Bruner, who I'm sure many will have heard of, very influential and famous developmental psychologist who wrote a lot about this. As you go up that scale, what you discover is that the period of immaturity gets longer, so the length of time that the young are being cared for and looked after by their parents, or one parent, or whatever it is, gets longer. And in that period of immaturity, they get more and more playful. And so all mammals engage in a variety of different sorts of play. And of course, human beings, interestingly, have the longest period of immaturity of any animal, and we are by a long way the most playful. So Bruner, back in the 1970s, was already speculating as to what might be the significance of that in terms of human children's development. In anthropology, lots of studies by anthropologists of different cultures, of course, and there have been particularly a lot of studies of children living in traditional hunter-gatherer societies. Now, this is important because you and I all have basically a hunter-gatherer brain, okay? The human species, Homo sapiens, if you imagine it being that end of that wall being when the first Homo sapiens was on the planet, and that wall being today, where do you think the point comes when we invented agriculture and started being not hunter-gatherers anymore? Where would you put it? Somewhere in the middle?
No.
Somewhere at that end?
Yeah.
It would be about there. Okay. Some sort of hominids have been on the planet for about 65 million years, and we invented agriculture about 10 to 12,000 years ago. So in terms of the adaptation, if we follow Darwin's theories about, selection of species and so on, in terms of the adaptation and evolution of the human brain, we've had this tiny little bit of time when we've not been hunter-gatherers. So we've all got a hunter-gatherer brain. So Peter Gray and other anthropologists have been and studied. There are about 30 or 40 extant hunter-gatherer societies still on the planet. And what do you think, how do the children learn to be effective hunters and gatherers living in the Brazilian jungle or the jungles of New Guinea or somewhere like that? What do you think the children do? Do you think they send them to school? Have piano lessons? What do they do? They do anything they like. There is no expectation that children would do anything in hunter-gatherer societies. Nothing is asked of them at all until they reach, around about puberty or some such, and then things kick in. And they play all day, every day. They do whatever they like, and they learn to be very effective members of their society. And they do it by playing at being their mums and dads. Okay. So you watch what the adults do, and they want to play at doing that. And that's the brain we've got. That's how we all learn. So interesting, isn't it, when you reflect on what we do with children these days and how far away we've got from that. Peter Gray is also famous for having written about the decline of play that was being discussed a moment ago, and linking that very clearly to the increase in mental health difficulties in children. And when you look at some of his evidence from looking at these different societies, and you think about how different children's lives are today to living in a hunter-gatherer society, and the demands made on them within the educational system, you can begin to see why there might be some of the problems. There is some neuroscience. There's some neuroscience on simple mammals, mainly mice and rats. And I'm going to come on to that a bit later, so I won't say anything about that now. But we also are beginning to have technologies whereby we can, at the moment, if you want to examine what's going on in somebody's brain while they're doing something, you have to have their head locked in position. Because the minute you move your head, you get massive electrical information coming out, and it completely masks the tiny little waves that are telling you, what activity is actually happening relevant to the task. So I think certainly within 10 years and probably within 5 years, we will have something wireless you can put on a child's head, you can let them play, and you can actually monitor which parts of the brain are doing what during that, which is going to be fascinating. But I'll come to that a bit later on. And in developmental psychology, we have a lot of evidence, which I might call in the nature of circumstantial. We have a lot of associations. We know that early playfulness is associated with early cognitive ability. We've known that for a long time. And we also know that playfulness is associated with emotional well-being. The problem is with associations, however, you don't know which way the causal relationship is. Or indeed, if a third factor is causing both of the two things that are associated. Did you know, for example, that so this is interesting evidence, but not very conclusive. So, did you know, for example, that you can predict your chances of getting to a good university and getting a good quality degree by the number of bathrooms in your family home? Did you know that? It's actually true. It's quite a strong association. But I think it's fairly obvious to you that if you want your children to get to Cambridge, building an extra bathroom on the back of the house might not be, the most effective way of doing that. So that's the problem with associations, and you get a lot of that in developmental psychology. So what I'm going to try and show you now in the rest of the talk is some evidence that is more experimental or natural experiments that start to unpick what's actually causing what. We also know that playful parents have children whose language is more developed than parents who are less playful with language. And again, you don't know whether the parents are responding to the child who happens to be good at language or the other way around, but I'll come back to that again later. There are various educational studies, and I'll just mention 2 or 3 quickly. You've got these on your sheets, obviously. So I'm not going to go through these in detail, we don't have time, but these are all studies showing, in the short term, a very close association between playfulness in the home or playfulness in the early childhood centre and various types of academic achievement or emotional and social outcomes. And some of this, to some people, might seem rather counterintuitive. So, for example, we have this term self-regulation that is thrown about these days, and I'm going to talk about it a bit in a moment. Some people would think that if you want your child to be very self-disciplined and organised and all the rest of it, that the best thing to do is to make them self-disciplined and organised in the home. Actually, it turns out to be exactly the opposite. If the child is over-supervised and over-structured in the home, they're less likely to be very good at regulating their behaviour in other contexts. And the study by Barker showed very nicely that children who are given a lot of freedom, and you were talking earlier about the loss of some personal freedom for children, and so whatever you can do in working with the parents that you work with to encourage them, and it can include things like, happily, a day on the beach, where there are adults present and so on and so forth, but nevertheless seems to support what we call cognitive self-regulation, and having fun at home is the sort of thing. There are also longitudinal studies which have a sort of like a natural experimental structure. So we're comparing children who've had one particular experience and children who in many ways are very similar. They're from the same area of the country, the same socioeconomic status of their parents, same educational level of their mother, etc., but nevertheless have very different outcomes. And there's a study here in Germany where they had play-based kindergartens and what they called early learning centres, which were much more instruction-based. and they very quickly, this happened in the 1990s, and they very quickly went back to having all play-based kindergartens because they discovered that the children the actual levels of academic achievement were greater in the long term. And the same sort of thing been found in the States, and some of you might be familiar with the EPI study, which was run in all over England in the 90s and early noughties, and found that children who had extended play-based preschool experiences made great gains in terms of movement into schooling, and particularly, and I think this is really important, it particularly makes a difference to children from disadvantaged backgrounds, which of course are the children we really need to think about. So I mentioned Jerome Bruner, but the other really important theoretician in this area is a man you've probably also heard of, Lev Vygotsky. And actually it's interesting that the evidence we have now in terms of mechanisms of what's actually happening in play that makes it such a powerful context for children to develop as learners and to develop their well-being. If you look back at their writings, you actually start to see some things, and all of these seem to have been supported by most recent research. So Vygotsky, in his writings about the role of play in development, by the way, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but just worth remembering, Vygotsky died in the 1930s, but was writing in Russian. So the dates are not when he wrote these things, the dates are when they were published in English. So he wrote about the role of play in development, and he talked about it being a transition towards abstract thought. So just to give you a silly example, if anything that's said or discussed in this evening's meeting particularly strikes your, arouses your curiosity or changes your way of thinking about things or something like that, when you're cycling home or when you're driving the car, when you get home, when you start thinking about it, you will think about it inside your head. As an adult, you have got the mental apparatus to be able to engage in abstract thought and to have a debate in your own mind and think about how that relates to what you thought before and so on and so forth. Young children don't have that ability, so if you were all 4-year-olds and I was talking to you about something and you got interested in it, you would go home and you would get your dolls out or your action men out or whatever, and you'd start playing about it, So you'd be Dr. Whitebread, what do you think of this rubbish, whatever, right? So when you watch young children engaging in that kind of small world play or acting out some sort of pretense or whatever, very often they're acting out things that relate to their experience, aren't they? And that's their way of doing what as an adult you can do in your head. So that's a really important insight and shows us why some forms of play might be really significant, and I'll show you some evidence on that later. It provides a context for children's greatest self-control. Now this is a really surprising and brilliant insight, because most people who don't work with young children and so on would tell you that the children are least self-controlled when they're playing. Play is viewed as kind of chaotic, random behaviour that doesn't follow any rules at all. But you and I know that actually when children are playing, it's very rule-based. I'll show you some examples that they're pretending to be. I haven't got this with me, but I shot a wonderful video probably about 15 years ago now of 3 little children, 3 or 4-year-olds playing doctors, playing hospitals. And one of them was the patient in the bed, and the other 2 were doctors, and they were getting out the toy stethoscopes and injecting this child with a syringe and all sorts of things. And after a little bit, the patient decided he, didn't want to play this game anymore, so he got out of the bed and wandered off. And one of the children, who was a doctor, got in the bed because he thought that looked nice. And then he giggles to himself. He goes, "Oh, I'm a doctor," and gets out of the bed and looks all kind of embarrassed because he's broken the rule. He should have been in the role of doctor. So it's very rule. It requires a lot of self-control, and it creates what Vygotsky called a zone of proximal development. So you know about this idea that children learn most powerfully when they're at the absolute limit of what they can possibly do. And your role often with young children is to support them in some way, all kinds of ways that you know how to do, that enable them to achieve something that they probably couldn't have managed on their own. But amazingly, and I'll show you a bit of evidence on this in a moment, children can do things in playful contexts they can't do when they're not playing. So if you want children, I hate this term, people talk about stretching children, which brings, pictures of medieval racks and things into my mind. But, when they talk about stretching children, the best way to stretch a child is to play with them, or to let them play with their friends or whatever. So there's all that kind of stuff going on. And Jerome Bruner, I mentioned earlier, talks about when you look at human problem solving compared to, say, even the most advanced of our early evolving neighbours such as chimpanzees or orangutans. Yes, they are pretty good problem solvers, but in a rather controlled and limited way. Whereas the huge variety of flexibility of human thought and action, is just in a totally different league. How does that happen? Is it related to the fact that we're so enormously playful? And does it play a key role, and this is one of the big questions, in human creativity and problem solving? So let's go on, and probably running out of time. I thought I'd show you this. If you want to read a bit about neuroscience and play, I would really recommend this book if you can find it in the library, The Playful Brain by Pellis and Pellis. These two, they're Italian-Americans, married couple, have been researching play in mice and rats for about 30 years, and this book sums up what they've found. And it's full of delightfully amusing diagrams of mice and rats engaging in various playful activities. So here we can see a picture of them engaging in what might be described in human terms as rough and tumble. Okay, so they're rolling around and they're nipping one another and giggling and so on, as we all did when we were children, as you probably do with your own children now, or whatever. Or sometimes you do it with your pets, don't you? Who has rough and tumble with their dog? Yeah, it's an intimate thing with your friends, whatever. But what they discovered was that, and of course you can't do this with children, but you are allowed, probably you shouldn't, but allowed to do it with rats, is you can deprive them of playful experiences. You can put them in a group with other adults who aren't playful, and you can take other baby rats and put them with other baby rats so they enjoy play. The ones who are deprived of play turn out to be rubbish adults. They're no good at relating to. Some of you might feel you married to somebody who wasn't very playful. I don't know. Anyway, they're rubbish. They're rubbish at being sensitive to other people's, other rats' feelings and so on. And they generally don't have or manage to either reproduce children at all, and if they do, they're dreadful parents. The ones who are allowed to be playful turn out to be really good at all of those important rat skills for being an effective rat. So it's very interesting. And the neuroscience comes in because they've actually shown that rats actually play in two main ways. They do this rough and tumble and they play with objects. And in each of those cases, they've shown that there are measurable gains and significant gains in the integration of particular areas of the rat's frontal cortex. So in play, and I think we've kind of known this for a long time, but we've now got really good at, these are a simple mammal. Whatever they're doing, we're doing, on steroids, as it were. It is actually building children's brains. This is something that people often come out with as a sort of, catchphrase, but actually, we've got pretty good evidence now that that's actually happening. And of course, the more integrated your neuronal circuits are in key areas of the frontal cortex, the better you're going to be at solving all kinds of problems and being a creative individual. And in fact, there's a report that I think is going to be on the web fairly soon, That's looking at the neuroscience of play. Now, you can't look at it very directly, but what in this paper has been done is they have looked at the characteristics, some of the characteristics of play. It's joyful, it's meaningful, and so on. It's actually engaging. And looked at what do we know about those kinds of experiences and what impact they have on the brain. By the way, I'm showing you the picture of the brain for two reasons. One is that this does actually identify the areas that are impacted during playful experiences. But the other reason is, and we have good evidence for this, is that if you're giving a talk, this is a handy tip for later when you're in my position, if you're giving a talk and you show the audience a picture of the brain, they're much more likely to believe everything you tell them and think that it's much more important and scientific. But I'm not doing it for that reason. But I mean, what a lot of this relates to is, I think, something that we, the first mechanism that we all recognise and is really incontrovertible is that play is fun. It's enjoyable, it's joyful, it's meaningful, it's actively engaging, and so on. By iterative, we mean children will keep working away at the same thing over and over again. I'm sure that's a behaviour you will have seen a lot. And it's often, not exclusively, but often it's social, it leads to various kinds of social interaction. And all of those things have an impact on, for example, dopamine levels in the brain that come from some of the glands in the limbic system in the middle of the brain. And we've got good evidence about how that enhances the efficiency and level of achievement of what you're doing. There is, however, another really important characteristic of play, and this relates back to something I was saying a little bit earlier, is that it's rule-based, and this is so little understood. And I just want to show you, this is a lovely piece of video. I didn't shoot this, this was on YouTube, and it's just some children, I think they're probably in Norway or Sweden. It's a kind of, forest school scenario, and they just come across a puddle, and you think, oh, they'll just splash about and do, muck about, nothing of any significance. But watch what happens. Okay. What happened? Did they just splash around? No, they made up a game, and the game had a rule. Yeah? And there was no conversation at all, but they just wanted to engage in some sort of rule-based little game there. Probably if that was a bunch of 5 or 6 adults, that you wouldn't have done that, I don't know. But children, that's what they do. They make up a game. And whoever filmed this, the early child educator was taking them out for a walk that day, just, was brilliantly perceptive to see that might be an important thing to video. This notion about creating the zone of proximal development. This is a lovely study that was done recently. It's now one of the things that's key within this notion of self-regulation is children being able to manage their attention, being able to focus on a task and avoid distraction. That's a key characteristic of a child who is well self-regulated. This is a study, and I've put a couple of quotes there, one from Vygotsky about how in play he claimed children always seem to be working as though they were a head taller than themselves at their highest possible level, and a quote from Mihaly Mahalia, I can't never say his name, he's Hungarian, who wrote a lot about this concept of flow, that when you're in play, in the play context, you lose track of time and space and so on, and you're just totally engaged, engrossed in what you're doing. Anyway, this was a study just to see what would be the impact of imaginative play in children on their ability to persevere. So this is what's called a vigilance task. So the children, they've got a screen in front of them, and they're told, and these are 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds, they're told, got something, a job for you to do. It's really important. It would really help us if you could do this. We'd like you to watch this screen, and every time a piece of cheese appears on the screen, we want you to press this button. All right, do you think you can do that? Yeah, okay. So the child's seeing, all sorts of random objects coming on the screen, and now and again there's a bit of cheese, and they have to go, oh, right, press the button. And that runs for 10 minutes. At the same time, there's another video over here showing a Disney cartoon, okay? Very distracting. And the simple measure is, how long does the child, in that 10 minutes, what proportion of the time are they actually looking for pieces of cheese, and what proportion of the time are they distracted by the Disney cartoon? Now, the really fun thing about this is they did it in 3 ways with the children, and they randomised the order so we didn't get kind of learning effects. They did it as themselves, which is the little bars on the left when they were self-immersed. They did it as a third person. Usually they were asked to do it. Pretend that you were your mum or dad. How would they do it? And you can see there's a bit of an improvement. And then they're asked to do it, and for this bit they were given a costume. They were asked to do it as if they were Batman. Okay. So you're a superhero, and they got a Batman costume, and they were pretending, oh yeah, I'm Batman, woo, And what happens? Massive. These are, statistically significant improvements. And obviously the 6-year-olds are doing better than the 4-year-olds all the way through, but the 4-year-olds are doing almost as well as the 6-year-olds did when they were being themselves. You're giving, those children are now acting almost 2 years above their level of ability because they're doing it as Batman. So, when we talk about children developing as learners, we talk about children achieving at high levels. If you want your children to really stretch themselves, you do it through imaginative play in that kind of way. Of course, there are lots of different sorts of play, and I've characterised them as being 5 different sorts. Physical play, what I've called symbolic play, which is playing with different ways of representing the world. So, for example, I could have done this talk through the medium of modern dance, right? But I'm not. I'm using language, but it's the same thing. It's a symbolic system. Play with objects we mentioned, so constructional play, games with rules that children often make up themselves, as we saw, and of course the most heavily researched type of play, pretense. I can't resist, by the way, talking to you about the drawing, because I was actually there when this little boy, 5-year-old, drew this, and so I was able to talk to him about it, and he said it's a man taking his dog for a walk. I thought it was a spider, but apparently it is a dog, and you can tell it's his dog because they've got the same hairstyle. And this is a nice example of what we call graphic vocabulary that children develop alongside verbal vocabulary. But all of these different sorts of play, there's been a lot of research looking at particular types of play, and what you find is that for any aspect of human development, there is a form of play. So just like the hunter-gatherer children who are learning to hunt and to gather and to do all the other things that people do in those, the children in our society are learning to do all those different kinds of things that we do through engaging in all these kinds of things. And it's really important that children are all given the opportunity to play in as many different ways as they possibly can. So implications for practice. So what I take from this is that there are a number of things that play is doing that in turn we know why they're so significant in terms of children developing as learners. And make no mistake about it, this is really important. This is absolutely crucial. From some of those earlier studies I showed you, if you give children a really rich, play-based experience for the 1 or 2 years that they're with you, you are changing the course of that child's life for the rest of their life. And we've got very strong evidence about that. The children who have had that experience compared to other similar children who haven't are way more likely to get involved in criminal activity. They're much more likely to finish up having a successful academic career, and the consequence is they're much more likely to get a better paid job and be able to establish and maintain friendships and intimate relationships and so on. So you are doing some of the most important work. You're not being paid anything like what you should be paid to do this, but you are doing some really, if we want to change the world for the better, this is when it happens, in those early years. So anyway, supporting self-regulation. This is just a lovely piece of video I took. I've just got a couple of pictures there of a little boy who wanted to put the fireman's jacket on. You ever come across children who can't quite manage to put a jacket on, or right? Whatever you do, don't do it for them. You know this, don't you? Don't do it for them. And this is a lovely example. This lasted about 3 or 4 minutes. The practitioner did a brilliant job. She never touched the child or the jacket once, but she modelled how to put your arm through. When he drops the jacket, she laughs and picks it up and gives it back to him. She said to him, picks it up. And she made light of it and made it all fun and was very emotionally supporting and so on. And eventually he manages to do it. And she's enabled that child to learn a very important lesson about, if I persevere and I try, I can do things that I didn't think I could do. And supporting children's ability to learn to persevere, to focus, to concentrate, and ultimately to achieve is, a very important lesson. And self-regulation, actually, properly understood, actually predicts all those kind of good things that we want for our children more powerfully than actually anything else. If your child is highly self-regulating but can't read, that's fine. If they can read but they're not self-regulating, you've got a problem, right? It's quite clear which of those is most important to be focusing on in the early years, and doing it through play. We got very strong evidence that play nurtures oral and expressive language. I mentioned to you earlier on, Christian Roskos did a review of this, all the studies on this showing that playful parents tend to engage in what are often called episodes of joint attention. They talk a lot to their children about what they're doing. They follow the child's lead. They don't lead the agenda. They let the child lead the agenda, and they talk to them about what the child is interested in. And these parents tend to have children whose vocabulary and other aspects of their language is much more advanced than children who are corrected, for example, or where the parents are trying to teach them language. So providing for playful social interactions between children, adults, and peers is really significant. Nobody's waving at me telling me that I've run out of time, so I'm carrying on. Is that all right? Good. Okay. So here's some nice studies of all kinds of ways in which children can work together collaboratively on a problem. In the picture on the left, this is children using blocks to build a house for this toy Dalmatian called Paws, and for some reason they decided that it had to lie Paws on the floor and then build the building so he exactly fitted into it. So every so often they'd take Paws out, build a bit, and then they put him back in to make sure he's still fitted. Which is quite a good technique. But the language that this kind of cooperative activity stimulates in this kind of imaginative play is really significant, as is the same kind of interaction I talked about, what we call episodes of joint attention, where the adult and the child are focusing on, and it can be anything. It can be a book, it can be something you're building together, it can be a recollection of a shared experience. That kind of talk where you're both having a discussion about something you're focusing on or sharing, predicts language development more powerfully than anything else. I often used to, when I was teaching young children, I often have parents come in, for an afternoon to help, and they say, what should I do? And I said, well, just sit down there and talk to the children about what they're doing. And they didn't feel they were doing anything very significant, but actually they really were. And eventually they believed me. I think it's really, really important to offer different types of play, a range of different types, because each type, here we've got a little girl playing on her own, doing some construction play, or we've got 3 children who've got little dolls and they're acting out some sort of, pretend narrative. You think of all the other sorts of different ways in which children play. Each of them are contributing, and so it's very important for us to, and I often get asked, well, what do you do with the child who just wants to play in the same way all the time? And that will happen. It's often a sign, as you will well recognise, of some sort of emotional difficulty the child has. And so probably worth, for a while, supporting the child in doing that, but all the time trying to make other play activities attractive to that child. That can happen, sometimes you might think there's a bit of a gender thing going on here, that the boys are all wanting to play with that, the girls all want to play with this. How can we get them to, to play with the other thing? And thinking of ways of making pretense or construction or physical play or whatever it is attractive to all the children. I'm sure you're very skilled at doing all of that. Some play theorists in the past have argued that it's only really play if there's no adults involved. I think that's a complete misunderstanding. In my experience, children love it when adults play with them, but it's about playing with them as a co-player, not directing the play. And there's all sorts of models of this, which I haven't got time to go into, but which, oh, you are waving at me, thank you. What are you waving at me? 2 minutes, right, okay. That's fine, we're on to the last slide. There are all sorts of ways through modelling behaviour, you playing alongside children. You know this stuff, if the children are playing with plasticine or with clay, the worst thing to do is to go up and say, what are you doing? I've seen that being done so many times by trainees, and what happens is 2 minutes later, they're playing with the clay or the plasticine and all the children have gone because they're being interrogated. But if you just go up and you start playing, the children will then start talking to you, won't they, about what you're doing, and then you're into a much more positive dialogue. So just to finish up then, these are really my final thoughts about implications, that children will develop as powerful learners who are emotionally well adjusted, where they have a balanced range of play opportunities across the 5 types, where they play alone with other children and with adults. They get different things from each of these kinds of experiences. That some of their play is what we might call free or initiated by themselves, and some is guided by an adult co-player. So you can make suggestions or show children things or whatever, and they will take that on and learn from it. We've got good evidence to support this now. That when you want to introduce them to a new idea or a new skill, it's so much better to do it in a playful context, because they will achieve at that higher level through doing it. So that's particularly, that's the way in, rather than starting off with instruction and then letting them play. And this approach is supported, and you know this of course, in the home and the school, So lots of really important work to do with parents who might not understandably know all about this kind of thing. So thank you for listening, and just to finally say that in the last 3 or 4 years, I've now retired, I was the founding director of the new Pedal Centre at Cambridge, Play in Education, Development and Learning. We're attempting to do world-class scientific research in this area, all sorts of exciting things going on. We have a newsletter that goes out every 3 months. So you can find us on Twitter. We have a website. If you would like to be on the mailing list, if you email and say that you'd like to be on the mailing list, you can receive news about what we're doing. We're also setting up a thing called Pedal Hub, and Pedal Hub is going to be a resource. So it's going to have it's going to have the latest research explained in ways that are understandable, and it's going to have examples of good practice, and it's going to have all sorts of articles and debates and so on that site. So I think you might find that helpful. Thank you very much.